Okay, and we're live.
Awesome.
So with that, do we want to start admitting folks?
Mhm.
Everybody ready to go?
Yes. Ready?
You're both absolute superstars. You're gonna rock it. I'm excited to just see you be awesome. So let's do it.
Sounds good.
All right. Hi, welcome to the attendees joining us. We're going to start our program at 1 o'clock, but feel free to just become familiar with the Neuro program. There is, of course, a room chat if you'd like to introduce yourselves. There's also a space for questions and answers. If there's anything you'd like to ask during the program, we are going to have a Q&A at the end, but feel free to start out by introducing yourselves if you'd like. And we do just want to notify folks that this program today is being recorded. So, just be aware of that the video will be recorded if you decide to speak at some time. But thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad to have you.
Said microphone? No, that's me. Oh God. Now what? I can't get through. I can't make this a big screen. Oh. Now what do I do? There's 13%.
Welcome to those of you who have joined us, since I last spoke here. We're so glad to have you all here today. Before we get started with the program in a few minutes, feel free to just become familiar with Neuro. There's a chat feature on the side, the room chat, if you would like to introduce yourselves or anything like that. We will have a Q&A at the end of today's program, so feel free to add any questions in the Q&A chat to the side as well. And we're just really glad to have you here. And we'll get started in a few. But once again, just feel free to familiarize yourselves, and we're looking forward to the program. And also, just so you're all aware, the program today will be recorded. So if you choose to speak at any point in time, we just want you to be aware of that. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to get started in a minute or so, but we're really glad to have everyone here. All right, seeing that the time is 1:03, I suppose we'll get started. And if more folks jump in and join us, that's awesome. But we're so glad to have you all here today. So welcome to the LGBTQ 101 program, Basics for Supporting LGBTQ+ Survivors. My name is Bridget Kessner, and I'm the Campus Services Coordinator with the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. I also facilitate our Queer Caucus Against Sexual Assault meetings and group. I will make some space for my co-facilitators today to introduce themselves.
Hi, so I'm Amanda Mendoza. I also work here at the Alliance as a post-conviction victim advocate. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and welcome. Thank you for coming.
Hi, welcome. My name is Barbie Curatolo. I'm one of the associate attorneys at the Victim Rights Center of Connecticut. My pronouns are she, her, hers.
Thank you both. I'm so glad to be working with you today. And I will also add, of course, my pronouns she, her, hers. So just before we get started, a few housekeeping things. I just want to ensure just for the program that folks do mute their mics, just so that there isn't additional feedback on the line. As a reminder, we are recording today's program, so you will have access to it after the fact, or if you have colleagues that were unable to attend, we'd be happy to send it over to them. However, we just want to put out a reminder in case anybody doesn't want to speak with that in mind during the recording. Just as a reminder as well, hopefully you saw this in the registration email, and when you initially had signed up, but there was an email that went out saying that the program goes until 3 o'clock. Today's program is scheduled to go until 3:30. However, the last part of that meeting, the meeting will be a Q&A portion. So if you're unable to attend, we would be more than happy to send you the recording to that, but hopefully you will be able to join us here until 3:30 today. Once again, there will be a Q&A at the end, and just for the sake of time, or because folks may need to leave us at 3 o'clock, we're just asking if you can hold questions until the end so we can get through the content. There is a Q&A chat within the chat portion you'll see at the right-hand corner of your screen. So feel free to put questions in there or just write them down and save them to the end. We want to ensure as well, we know a lot of folks are working from home under varied circumstances, working in offices where they need to attempt to take some precautions for themselves due to COVID. So feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourselves in this space. If you need to step away, once again, the recording will be available. We're just glad to have you here in whatever capacity you can be. We will have a break midway through the program. And then lastly, we just want to remind everyone that we are talking about some sensitive topics, such as sexual violence, a bit about intimate partner violence, of course, homophobia, transphobia, and violence against LGBTQ folks to some extent. So just be sure to take care of yourselves through that program. If you need to step away at any point, we completely understand. Again, we'll have the recording available to you, but your self-care is really what is most critical. So we wanted to provide that content warning from the gate. So some objectives for today's programs: we're hoping to understand terms and the LGBTQ spectrum better. We're hoping to share more information about a brief history of the LGBTQ rights movement. We're hoping that attendees can gain insight regarding the marginalization of LGBTQ folks. We are hoping that attendees will be able to be better allies to LGBTQ folks in their communities and those that they may serve. And then we are also hoping that attendees can learn more about additional LGBTQ resources in their community, in the state and nationally. So with all of that being said, I will pass it on to my co-facilitator, Amanda.
Thank you. Thanks again, everyone, for being here again. So of course, for us to just kind of dive into all these topics, we need to start right from the basic blocks. What is LGBTQ? What does it stand for? It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. So this is an acronym that's used by the community. It's used as an umbrella term to describe an individual's sexual orientation and or their gender identity. This acronym that you see here does not solely represent the letters and identities that you see, which is why you might see many variations of this acronym. So you may have seen GLBT, LGBT, LGBTQ+, LGBTQIA, and so on. So just know that if you ever see any type of variation of that, just know that it's the umbrella that encompasses everyone within that community, not just the letters that you see. So another variation of that is this longer acronym here, LGBTQIAP+. So, I don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed by seeing all these letters. We are going to be going over these definitions later. And of course, right, we're all learning. So it's okay to just, if you have like a notebook on the side, or again, we're going to be recording this, or it is being recorded. So you can always go back and look this back as a reference. So when looking around the world, this acronym can actually look very different. That's due to, cultural influences in their communities that may not be seen here in the US, but, for the acronym that we're talking about at this time, we'll be looking more specifically at US history and just the community within the US, although there may be similarities in other countries as well. So I just kind of wanted to pose a question, so you all can type in the chat on the bottom right corner. How many of you received any LGBTQ history education while in K through 12 or in college? You could just write yes or no. All right, we got a lot of no's. No, never. No, no. Oh, one yes. No, yes, yes. No, 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 no. Okay. So there was a few sprinkles of yeses in there, but primarily a lot of no's. Yes, but sought out. Perfect. Love that. So we're going to kind of go into the history a little bit, because I think that it's really important to understand kind of where the LGBTQ liberation movement came from, what did it look like, and how did we get here? Because that'll kind of give us a framework of, you know, what the community has been through, continues to go through, and what we're fighting for. So with that, I'm going to show you a little video, and we'll move forward with that. Make sure your volume is up too. Should be okay.
Stonewall riots were a watershed moment in the gay rights movement, sparking activism and awareness across the United States.
All right. Are people still not able to hear it? Is there a little like volume button on like the bottom right corner? Oh, okay. So I will continue to play it and hopefully it'll work. Or did you need me to start over? Okay, so I'm sorry that some of you, if not most of you, weren't able to hear the video. It was very quiet when looking or hearing it. So just to kind of give a brief synopsis, I did send the link, so please feel free to look through that afterwards, because I really like this video because it's a very quick snapshot of what led to the riots. So just know that for the LGBTQ community, so one moment, there was a lot of inequality, pain, and anger that everyone was facing. And this riot kind of led to many decades of that discrimination that they were facing. So for instance, like in the 1930s, homosexuality was declared a mental illness at the time. Police were conducting like operations to arrest, gay individuals by using undercover cops to try to talk to them. So these laws were essentially forcing the LGBTQ community to hide, their behavior, their identity, just being who they are. And just for fear of being persecuted or for being harassed, thrown in jail. At the time, employers were able to fire people on the basis of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, similar to the military. If they found out, you'd be kicked out and fired. People were very angry, and rightfully so. So this video was about the Stonewall riots, which was a bar in New York City that was kind of a homage to queer folks that would come over there and just try to, be able to be free, yet the mafia was still, manipulating the LGBTQ community by, selling really overpriced drinks. They were still letting police know when people were there. So when the police came, riots had started because they were fed up, again, rightfully so. And I apologize for butchering, all of this. It's a really great 4-minute video. So I do recommend watching it after this program. Again, I'm sorry that the volume was completely just very quiet. But just to give a little bit more facts about these Stonewall riots too, some important activists during this time, if you look at the top right corner of the screen, you'll see some individuals standing right there. So on the left side is Martha P. Johnson, and to the right of her, or I guess to her left, is Sylvia Rivera. So these were both 2 trans women who had, of course, experienced much discrimination and harassment in their time, yet they created incredible impacts for the LGBTQ liberation movement. So Martha was best known for her role in the 1969 Stonewall riots uprising. You have to think, right, in 1969, we didn't have cell phones. There were no recordings of these things, of what was happening. So it's not completely clear of what exactly happened. Martha, a lot of people were saying that she threw the first brick in the bar, or the first shot glass that kind of started it all. There were interviews with Martha where she had said, no, I didn't show up until after it had started. But there were many accounts of people saying, no, we did see her, or we saw her do this instead. And I think the reason why she's, thought of so much is because there was so much that she contributed to the community. So even if that isn't necessarily completely clear of how did it all start, I think if we look back at a lot of history, there's a lot of speculation. Kind of what she provided afterwards, including Sylvia, is that they provided work in supporting low-income LGBTQ people of color in that time as well. So they co-founded a political collective called STAR, which stood for, at the time, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. It's no longer called that. It's now the Street Transgender Action Revolutionaries. And what this collective did is they provided housing for queer youth and sex workers in Lower Manhattan. And this was just, a sliver of what, they contributed to this movement, and just helping the community and being an activist for it. So again, very quick sliver of history. And 2, just to point out, the name for STAR, what we'll notice over time is that some terminology that was used in the past is either no longer in use, because it's being considered derogatory, and we'll talk about those things a bit later too, or some terminology that's been reclaimed. But don't worry about that. We will go over those things. But yes, if there's any other questions, of course, we'll have our Q&A afterwards. I apologize again for the video. Okay, so just looking at some recent history within the last 20 years, which again, was not too long ago. So activists started using the term LGBT in the US at around 1988. I think that's important to note because that's kind of when they all came together, said, we are a cohesive unit, we're fighting for the same things, we want equality, and we want to be treated fairly, just to be ourselves. So in 2003 was the decriminalization of homosexuality in the US. Again, not too long ago. The next law we have here is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. So this law was in response to 2 murders that occurred to these 2 men in 1998. So due to that, they added in to the federal hate crime law to include crimes that were motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. So that was only added in on 2009. In 2015, as some of us may already know, same-sex marriage was legalized in the US. And just a year ago, the Supreme Court ruled that an employer firing someone for being gay or transgender violates their civil rights. Now, just because, they've ruled that, it's not a federal law at this point. So the reason why I'm showing all of this is because LGBTQ folks, we're still fighting for discrimination or fighting against discrimination to this day. And simply making something legal also doesn't mean that the job is done. There's still much discrimination, much harassment, so much work that needs to be done for the LGBTQ community to be treated equally and with compassion. And that's why you're all here, which is a great first step, right? Just learning about, how to support someone who is LGBTQ. And then, more specifically later on, we'll talk about survivors of sexual violence who are LGBTQ. So, and just lastly, to wrap it all together, right? Already kind of said it, the community still fighting for equality to this day. And that's why we kind of, again, very brief history here of the LGBTQ liberation movement and kind of where we're headed. So it's still happening here in the US, and there's still much more to look into. But if there's any questions about this later on, then feel free to send it in the Q&A later. And hopefully, again, I apologize for the video, but definitely take a look at that once this program is over. And I will let Barbie take it away.
All right. Well, now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about language. And it's important to note right off the bat that language is constantly evolving. So new terms are being added all of the time. And while these new terms are being added, other terms are becoming outdated and less favored. In addition, there have been terms that have been reclaimed and are now being used in a different way than they originally have. So today we're going to be talking about some basic terms and concepts, and having a foundational knowledge of these terms and concepts will help us navigate any changes to the language in the future. And before we jump in, I want to start with some general guidelines. The first of which is that parts of speech matter. The terms that we're going to be talking about today are adjectives, meaning they are words that describe a noun. And it's very important to keep that in mind because these terms are used to describe a person and part of their identity. And it's important that we use these terms as adjectives as opposed to nouns and verbs, because when we use these terms as nouns, we're indicating that this part of their identity encompasses the person's entire self. Or if we are to use these as verbs, we're indicating that we think that this term is of action, that it's something that somebody can decide to do. So it's very important that we use these terms as the adjectives that they are and use them to describe a person. Another guideline to keep in mind is the 51 out of 100 rule. And what this rule recognizes is that these definitions that we will be talking about are the most commonly used, or the definitions that a majority of people use for these terms. But the 51 out of 100 people rule helps us recognize that even if a majority of people use this particular definition, that there's still a large number of people, 49 out of 100, that may use this term differently, or this term may mean something different for them. So it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about some of these terms. So we're going to begin our conversation talking a little bit about the gender binary and why it is problematic. So the gender binary categorizes all people into only two categories, male and female. And it assumes that because of the category that a person is in, you can determine different aspects of that person's identity. So the way that it works is that if a person is assigned male at birth, they would be lumped into the category of male and would then be expected to have a gender identity of male and express that gender identity in a masculine manner and have both the sexual and romantic attraction to that of the opposite category, female, which under the gender binary would be assumed to be a person who is assigned female at birth, who has a female gender identity, expresses that gender identity in a feminine manner, and has both a romantic and sexual attraction to that of the opposite category, male. And these are the only two options available under the gender binary. So it is extremely problematic because it fails to recognize that each of these facets of a person's identity are not only different from one another, but they also exist on their own spectrum. And you may notice that I use the term sex assigned at birth, or assigned female at birth, or assigned male at birth. I didn't use the term biological sex, or natal, or male or female born, or terms like that, because those terms are really outdated. They imply that that label, that designation, is more quote unquote real than other parts of a person's identity. And they don't accurately describe what is actually happening. So what actually happens when there is a sex assigned at birth is that when a person is born, a medical professional looks at the baby human and interprets the baby human's physical anatomy and assigns that baby human a sex assigned at birth. So the physical anatomy is used to determine this, or the chromosome makeup or hormonal levels. And a person is interpreting these in order to assign that baby human a sex assigned at birth. And you may hear the terms AFAB and AMAB, which are acronyms meaning assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth. And while sex assigned at birth is commonly viewed as a binary, it's more accurate to view it as a spectrum. And this is where the term intersex comes into play. So the term intersex is an adjective used to describe a person with a less than common combination of hormones, chromosomes, and anatomy that are typically used to assign a sex assigned at birth. And as we talk about the term intersex, I'm going to bring to mind the guideline that parts of speech matter. So intersex is an adjective. And what that means is that we do not conjugate the term intersex when we are describing a person. So it would be intersex person. We would not add an ED to the end of intersex in order to describe somebody. And the reason for this is that when nouns and verbs are being used as adjectives, they are conjugated using an ED. But for adjectives, they do not need to have an ED added to them because they're already an adjective. So I know that's very abstract, so I'm going to give a little bit of an explanation to try to make sense of those rules. So let's say that a little child paints a rock. Later, a person comes across the painted rock. So the verb to paint, when being used as an adjective, changed to be painted. The rock is now painted. But for adjectives, we don't need to add that ed to it. So the little child remains a little child. We're not changing it to littled. In the same way, intersex is already an adjective, so we would not add an ed to the end of it. And if we were to do that, it again is implying that intersex is not an adjective already, and would be implying that it is a noun, again encompassing a person's entire self, or a verb, meaning that it's an action that a person can choose to do. So it's very important that we use these terms as adjectives and that we don't conjugate them. And the same is true for a couple terms that are used to describe the correlation between a person's gender identity and the person's sex assigned at birth. So gender identity is a person's internal sense of being male, female, both, neither, or other gender or genders. And this is different than a person's gender expression or performance, which is a person's physical manifestation of that person's gender identity, either through their hairstyle, their clothing, or their mannerisms. And just to use myself as an example, I have the gender identity of female, but I express my gender identity in a manner that's very masculine. I have a masculine haircut, I wear masculine clothes, and the fact that I have that masculine expression does not negate or detract from the fact that my gender identity is female. So while these are related, they're not the same, and you cannot determine a person's gender identity based on their gender expression alone. And there are a couple terms that are used to describe the relationship between a person's gender identity and their sex assigned at birth. So the term cisgender or cis is an adjective describing a person whose gender identity aligns with their sex assigned at birth. Transgender or trans is an adjective describing a person whose gender identity differs or does not align from the sex assigned at birth. And again, just like we talked about with the word intersex, cisgender and transgender are already adjectives, meaning they're not conjugated when used to describe a person. It's a cis person or a cisgender person or a trans person or transgender person. And just like sex assigned at birth, gender identity exists on a spectrum. So there are a few terms that you may hear because of this. And genderqueer is one of those terms. So genderqueer is an identity commonly used by those who do not identify or express their gender within the gender binary. Gender fluid is a gender identity and or presentation that is not fixed but changes. And non-binary, which is abbreviated as NB or pronounced as NB, is an umbrella term for all genders other than male, female, or woman, man. So I'm just going to use myself as an example again, just to try to highlight the differences between these terms. As I mentioned before, my gender identity is female, but I express that gender identity in a masculine manner. Under the gender binary, I would be expected to express my gender identity in a feminine manner because my gender identity is female. So because I express my gender identity in a masculine manner, I do not fit within the gender binary and its expectations. Therefore, I can consider my gender expression to be genderqueer. But my gender identity never changes. It's always female. And my presentation of my gender is always fixed. I always present in a more masculine manner. Therefore, I would not consider myself to be gender fluid because my gender identity and my presentation do not change. In addition, my gender identity is female, so therefore it fits into the category of either male or female. So I do not identify as non-binary. However, if a person had a gender identity as genderqueer, that person's gender identity would not be male, female, or woman, man. So therefore, that person may identify as being non-binary because their gender does not fit within that gender binary. And as we're talking about gender and gender identities, it's important to make note that pronouns often imply gender. So it's very important that we use a person's gender pronouns correctly. And you may notice that I say pronouns or gender pronouns. I'm not using the term preferred pronouns. And the reason for that is the term preferred pronouns is outdated. And that's because the term preferred gives the impression that there's a choice, that you could choose to use that pronoun or not. And it negates the fact that this is a part of a person's identity, that this pronoun is their pronoun. So we're going to ask for a person's gender pronouns or their personal pronouns or just simply pronouns. And we'll talk more a little bit about pronoun use later today, but it's important to note that we would not use the term preferred when talking about a person's gender pronouns. And next, we're going to talk about sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is a person's sexual, physical, romantic, emotional, aesthetic, and or any form of attraction to others. And as you may notice, as I'm explaining this definition, there are a lot of different types of attraction. And while it's commonly thought that these attractions align and go the same way, essentially, they don't. Each different type of attraction exists on its own separate spectrum. And the terms asexual or ace and aromantic or aro help to exemplify part of this. Asexual denotes a lack of sexual attraction or interest in others, whereas aromantic denotes a lack of romantic attraction or interest in others. Now, not all asexual people are also aromantic, and not all aromantic people are asexual. And that's because those different forms of attraction, sexual attraction and romantic attraction, exist on their own separate spectrum. So you can see now that it makes defining a person and labeling a person's sexual orientation very different. So it's important to recognize that when we're talking about a person's sexual orientation, we're talking about the person's primary attraction, not sole attraction. And we're also talking about a person's capability of being attracted. Like, a person is not going to always be attracted in every sense of different type of attraction to every person of a particular gender. Rather, sexual orientation denotes a capability of having an attraction of some sort to one or many genders. So it's important to keep those in mind. And as we're talking about these different forms of attraction existing on different spectrums, it's understandable why this term queer is becoming increasingly popular. And that's because queer is an inclusive term for all people of marginalized gender identities and sexual orientations. So anyone who does not fit within the expectations of that gender binary in any manner, whether it is from their sex assigned at birth, their gender identity, their gender expression, or any form of their attractions. And the reason why this word is growing in popularity is because it is so inclusive, that it brings all of these different gender identities and sexual orientations together in one queer community. So it's very inclusive, but it is also ambiguous and vague. If somebody identifies as queer, they're not necessarily denoting to the person and explaining each separate facet of their identity and their sex assigned at birth, their gender identity, each of their different types of attraction to people. So this can be a very safe way of saying that indicating that this person identifies as part of this community without necessarily outing themselves, feeling like they need to explain themselves, or outing their intimate partner. Because as we recall, in the gender binary, part of the expectations is that you will be sexually and romantically attracted to a person who also fits into that gender binary exactly, just in the opposite category. So sometimes it is a lot safer for a person to identify as queer, not only for themselves, but for their intimate partners as well. But it's important that when we're using this term, that we're using it correctly, because queer is a reclaimed term. It originally used to have a negative connotation. So we're going to make sure that we use this term as an adjective. And when we're talking about a queer person, we're going to be using that term only for people who have identified themselves as being queer. And in that way, we're going to make sure we use this carefully so that it does not have that negative connotation that it originated with. So I know that I threw a lot of different abstract concepts and terms at you. So we have an activity for you to do, and we will give you 5 minutes to do so. We're going to put a link in the chat to a gender unicorn. Now, this gender unicorn is interactive, and you'll be able to fill out different aspects of this gender unicorn's identity and see how each of them exist on their own spectrum. So I encourage you to use the link in the chat to fill out your own gender unicorn. And don't worry, we're not sharing this with each other. It's just for your own use so that you can practice with some of these terms and concepts.
We do have one question in the chat from the previous slide that you had, if you wanted to take that moment to answer. It's, could you explain the difference between genderqueer and transgender? I am understanding both to be someone whose gender identity does not match the gender binary's expectations of their assigned sex. So I guess, yeah, just the difference between genderqueer and transgender.
Right. So genderqueer can be used as a way of as a term used to explain somebody's gender identity and their gender expression. So a person may consider their gender identity to be genderqueer. Transgender is a term that talks about the correlation between a person's gender identity and their sex assigned at birth. So if a person was assigned male at birth, if that person has any other gender identity that does not align with their sex assigned at birth, so if they have any other gender identity than male, since they were assigned male at birth, that person would be considered to be a transgender person. So if a person identifies as having a gender identity as genderqueer, that identity would not fit within. That person may also identify as transgender because the genderqueer identity does not align with the sex assigned at birth. So I hope that that helps explain that. But the term transgender and cisgender are used to explain the relationship between a person's sex assigned at birth and their gender identity.
They say, yes, it did. Thank you.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah. This person wants to see the sexual orientation slide one more time. We can do that. Is it this one? And feel free to like take a picture of it too with your phone, in case we can't pull it up for enough time.
Okay.
But you'll definitely get this.
I did see, so the question asking if you can be genderqueer, but not necessarily transgender, and you can. So as I used myself as an example, my gender expression does not align with my gender identity in the way that the gender binary would expect it to. So I would consider myself to be genderqueer. However, I identify as having a female gender identity. So because I was assigned female at birth and I have a female gender identity, I am a cisgender person. So you can be genderqueer and not necessarily transgender. So yes.
Mm-hmm. There's also another question. We're just throwing you all the questions today. Could you explain the pronoun Z? I know it's not super common, but has never been fully explained to me.
We will actually be talking about gender pronouns later. I'm not
yeah,
sure
you're right.
one that's included in that one.
Yeah, so we can come back to that.
But it's essentially a pronoun that isn't specifically gendered, as opposed to my pronouns, which are she, her, her, indicates that I have a female gender identity, and Z is indicating that this person does not identify with either a female gender identity or a male gender identity because they would prefer a pronoun that doesn't indicate either.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you've done your gender unicorn, if you're still doing it, that's totally fine. But this is where we're going to be taking our 10-minute break. So it's 1:45 currently. So feel free to do whatever you have to do. And then we will reconvene at 1:55. Thank you all for staying this far along. So. So we'll be coming back in a few minutes. So just prepare for us to do an activity together, and I will let you know what that will look like. We'll be back in about another 60 seconds. So just make your way back from grabbing water, doing what you got to do. Okay, so we're going to come back now. I hope you all had a great break. So for this next activity, we're going to be breaking out into groups of probably 7. And so with this, the way that this program works is, so we're all in this main room right now, and Bridget's going to do some sort of magical thing where everyone splits up into groups of 7 into your own little personal breakout rooms. And here's what the activity is going to entail of. So for the next minute or so, I just want you to think of an exciting moment of your life that makes you very happy. You know, when you think about it, that gives you joy. It could be, doesn't need to be too personal, although if you want to share that, that's fine too. And when you break out into the rooms, you'll just need to unmute yourself so that you can talk to each other. You can go on video if you would like to and if you're comfortable, but that you won't be forced to. As well as just, I know we mentioned earlier that we are recording, but the breakout rooms won't be recorded. So just know that we're only recording what's in the main screen. So you might be already thinking of something right now. So once you have that moment in your head of what you'd like to share, here's the rules for this next part. So you cannot talk about your spouse, your partners, your friends, work, school, achievements, or hobbies. I wish you luck, and we'll break out into the rooms right now.
Hey, Amanda, how long would you like them in there?
We'll give them like 5 minutes since there's more of them.
Okay. A couple of them at 8, just because of new rows.
Yeah.
But
That's
there
okay.
weren't more than 8, and most of them at 7.
Okay, that's totally fine. Yeah, I know there's a lot of people here.
And I'm just going to email that person that Judith had put the email in for with the link to the new room.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I didn't understand that she needed the link, so my bad on that.
No worries. Do you want me to send a 2-minute warning?
That would be good.
Just let me know whenever you want me to call everyone back. It's just a button, so.
Yeah, we could bring them back.
All right. I also included both of you on the email I just sent to that participant. So if they have any technical issues while I'm presenting, feel free to help out.
Okay.
All right, calling them back. End of breakout.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. So just if you aren't already muted, just do that in case any noise or feedback comes in. Okay, so the activity you just did was, right, thinking of an exciting moment of your life that makes you very happy and joyful. And the rule was that you cannot talk about your spouse, your partners, friends, work, school achievements, etc. So maybe a few of you can share, or if each group, I'm not sure how many groups there were, but what were your thoughts? How was this activity for you? What were some things, if you feel comfortable sharing, what would you like to share? I guess feel free to unmute. I know there's a lot of us, but if anyone would like to go, feel free to speak out. Oh, I see Sunny wrote, frustration came up for me. Frustrating because we couldn't talk about much. Mm-hmm. Were there anything, or was there anything that you were able to say or felt that you could say? From the group I was in, some things that bring us happiness, we are unable to do at this time because of COVID restrictions. Yep, makes sense. Leaving my abusive relationship. Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Eva. Mm-hmm. Definitely frustrating. Yeah. So there weren't many things probably that could come up, or if there were, right, probably very specific. So kind of with this activity, is sleeping a hobby? Yes, of course. Well, I mean, I guess it could be because it's also a basic need. So part hobby, part basic need. I'll let it pass. That's okay. Too many limitations. Mm-hmm. Oh. Okay, so this person says, it was interesting that the thing I came up with fit the rules, but I realized that just about any follow-up question that might come up would almost certainly put me at risk of discussing one of the taboo topics. Yeah, that's definitely an important note to make here. Oh, no sound? Can anyone hear me right now? One moment. So, hello? Can any of you hear me at this moment?
How about me? You can hear me?
Okay. Maybe I can leave and come back.
Sure.
Okay. All right.
Thank you all for your patience with technology. It's something I know we're all learning in the age of COVID. In the meantime, if anybody had anything else they'd like to share about the program, about the activity, feel free to put it in the chat. Looks like Amanda's back in. Okay. So we have some feedback saying my happy moments started to make me sad because I couldn't share them. That definitely makes sense. All right, so it looks like Amanda's having some technical issues here. I think that this activity forced us to think about happiness in a way we haven't before. Definitely. Here, just give me 1 second. I'm going to try and work out the technical issues if you want to manage the chat, Barbie.
Okay, so we have a comment that realizing how much happiness depends on others, or family, or hobbies.
All right, well, it seems we're continuing to have some tech issues here. Barbie, would you want to explain the activity, or would you like me to explain the activity? And then hopefully we can loop Amanda back in.
You can go for it. I'll try to get Amanda back in.
Sure, sounds good. So I think the next question we would ask is, what do you think that this represents for the LGBTQ community? So in what ways do you think that your feelings around this activity or your experience with this activity could relate to the way that somebody who's LGBTQ might engage with other folks in their own space? Feel free to use the chat. How you might not be able to share your happiest moments due to being judged over your identity. Absolutely. Frustration came up for a lot of people. Absolutely. Feeling isolated, for sure. Any other feedback? Your happiness may come from people.
Bridget, your sound is
Feeling very restricted.
Bridget,
Yes.
your sound is
Okay, thank you.
I apologize for the multiple technical difficulties. Bridget will be joining momentarily, and we're still trying to get Amanda back. So I apologize. Thank you for your patience and hanging with us. Okay, hang on. I think we should take a 5-minute break while we try to get our moderators back. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Let's try to reconvene at 2:20, about 5 minutes from now, And I apologize for the difficulties, and we'll try to be back in 5 minutes when you return.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay. Thank you for letting me know. All right. So the only thing I need is to, well, I don't have access to change the slides. So Barbie or Bridget, if you're able to do that while I'm doing this, then we're good.
Yep, got you.
All right. Thank you so much. So sorry again, everyone. Oh, wait, was that the 5-minute break? Did people, I'm not sure if that was the 5 minutes we gave.
We still have a couple minutes, but if we just...
And I think for the sake of time, if we want to move forward with the activity, and then we'll jump into the rest of the content.
Yes, sounds great.
Well,
All
again,
right.
so much for your patience.
You are right. Thank you so much. So I was looking through all of the messages of what everyone was saying. So you were all pretty much on the ball. So I'll just ask again, what do you think this represents for the LGBTQ community? Let me scroll up. So someone wrote, very frustrating. Humans crave connection, and not having that affects LGBTQ people wanting to make those connections. Feeling like you can't share the most important parts of who you are with loved ones, which is one of the best parts of the human experience. Definitely, yeah, great answers all aboard. So essentially, right, someone not being able to talk about all of these aspects of our lives that make us who we are and just like helps us, get out of bed in the morning, because these are things that just like make life better in some ways, right? And for someone within the community who maybe can't share like a partner that they've been with for X amount of time, or maybe an exciting like date that they went on, or maybe maybe they came out to a friend about their sexuality or their gender identity, and that's something they feel really proud about, but maybe they can still only share that with a certain few people that they feel safe with. And that can feel very isolating, and it kind of puts a damper on the things to feel excited about, because there's always a cloud over them for things that they can't share. And so even though this activity revolved around talking about exciting things, right, this can also impact even some of the bad parts of our lives, right? So, I mean, the second half of this presentation is going to be about how we can support survivors who survivors of sexual violence who are LGBTQ. So, for instance, if someone was sexually assaulted by their partner, and maybe it was a same-sex partner, right? There might be some limitations for them on who they can share that with, because now there's this other barrier that they're facing, depending on if they are not out to that person. It may prevent them from fear of going to the police, for fear of any sort of biases that officer may potentially have towards them. So just kind of start thinking about those things as we move on to our next topic. But thank you again, everyone, for participating. I'm at least glad that the breakout rooms worked out, and hopefully it'll be smooth sailing from here.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you all once again for your patience and just for being present here with us today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of sexual violence on LGBTQ communities. It's important to understand that sexual violence disproportionately impacts folks who are in the LGBTQ community. So, for instance, lesbian and bisexual women are 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence than heterosexual women. 2 in 5 gay men will be sexually abused. 1 in 2 transgender folks will experience sexual violence. And unfortunately, the statistics go on. And we know that LGBTQ folks are facing these disproportionate rates, but they are also facing different barriers to achieving help within any system. So really our goal with this program is to talk more about what those barriers look like in order to start taking them down. So just some reminders before we dive in. Intersecting identities and oppressions create additional barriers. So when we think about things like race, income, disability, while folks may have barriers because of their LGBTQ identity, there are other identities that they may have that have an impact as well. It is one of the core components of advocacy to remove barriers before survivors encounter them. So it's really critical that we start to do this work now. Before we're potentially meeting folks and serving folks, to ensure that our programs are accessible and so on. Barriers should be the responsibility of the community or service to address and remove, not the responsibility of the survivor to overcome. And barriers, additional tactics of abusers, and additional types of sexual violence are a result of the oppression and not LGBTQ people and their identities. And that's something that's really critical to identify because it really looks at what is going to need to change in order for these barriers to come down and in order for folks to be served adequately. It puts the responsibility in each of our hands to kind of remove those barriers. And it also sends the message to LGBTQ folks that their identities are not a problem, not a fault. So let's talk a little bit about what those barriers might look like for someone. So there may be fear of reinforcing negative stereotypes that already exist in their community. When we think about stereotypes about LGBTQ folks, it may be said that they are predatory, they may be hypersexualized, and otherwise kind of seem to be deviant in society. And while we know that none of this is true, unfortunately, folks that may want to come forward and report sexual violence against another member of that community may face concern that it would further embed those stereotypes in people's minds. Additionally, they may fear that others may not necessarily take their victimization seriously because of a stereotype that's carried about the community. So if somebody believes that they are being hypersexualized, what sort of victim blaming might they come up against if they decide to come forward about sexual violence? Similarly, when we talked about not wanting to necessarily bring up that stereotype in regards to a perpetrator, there are definitely a series of challenges that come from experiencing violence from another member of that community. Not only do you not want to kind of attach that stigma that already exists in the community to the person that had done that harm, provided they are within that same community, but that person may be monopolizing resources. It may be a small, tightly knit group, depending on the kind of social circle that's involved. You know, if you think about, for instance, I work a lot with campuses, so you think about maybe, you know, a university or college pride club that only has a couple of dozen members. What does it look like to have that dynamic within that setting? And then, of course, they may fear or have the reality of not being believed by their peers because of the relationship that their peers may have with the person who harmed them. Survivors may struggle to recognize their experience of sexual violence or validate it to the extent that they should be able to, because their experience may not fit into traditional narratives that we see about sexual violence. So oftentimes we'll see very, you know, heteronormative, cisnormative examples of sexual violence that exist, whether it be in the media or in programming. And those examples, because they exclude LGBTQ folks from the narrative, may put those same survivors in a position where they have trouble validating their experience because all of they've learned about sexual violence has been so gendered. There may also be an impact of some internalized oppression. If somebody has internalized the oppression that they faced individually or, you know, kind of on a larger social level, they may believe that they aren't necessarily deserving of help. And while they are just as deserving as any other survivor, it may be hard for them to recognize that because of the messages that they've received and internalized. There may also be a fear of further stigma. So, of course, we recognize that LGBTQ identities are stigmatized in our society. And we also know, those of us who work with survivors, that, you know, being a victim of a crime or a survivor of sexual violence, depending on the community that you are in, can also hold a stigma. So what does it mean for a person who's already feeling stigmatized to attach another potentially stigmatized identity, once again, depending on their community and life experience, but what would it mean for them to attach that to themselves as well? They may have experienced some history of mistreatment in medical settings or within the criminal justice system. They may not know that they have options for advocacy outside of those systems, you know, through you know, a rape crisis center or other avenues, or they may even wish to move forward through a medical system or criminal justice reporting process, but feel as if that isn't an option for them because of the violence and oppression that have come from those systems, either to them as a person individually, to folks that they may know, or to the community at large. If somebody is closeted, they may fear that something about the narrative could potentially, if they were somewhere that would suggest perhaps they're LGBTQ. You know, maybe, again, the story started, somebody was at a pride meeting, somebody was at like an LGBTQ bar, an LGBTQ event. What might that mean for them to have to share that narrative with others if they're in the closet still? Additionally, depending on the dynamic, they may fear that the perpetrator may out them, either because they've threatened to do so or they perceive that threat. And then lastly, unfortunately, there's been a lot of normalized violence against LGBTQ folks. So experiencing that violence over the course of, you know, months, years, a lifetime could really, you know, create a process by which somebody would really start to normalize experiencing violence, unfortunately. So because that violence is normalized, they may not necessarily reach out for help and support the way that somebody who is not normalized a lot of that violence would. So we'll also talk a little bit about what tactics of abusers can potentially look like. The oppression in the situation creates additional tactics that abusers may use to exert power and control in a situation of sexual violence. So this could include potentially outing or threaten to out a survivor. And we know, of course, outing someone without their consent is an act of violence in itself. They may reinforce the fear to the survivor that no one is going to help them, especially, again, if that person is experiencing some internalized oppression and may already believe that about themselves or have gotten that message from other folks. And they may also monopolize support or resources in what may be a small or closely knit community, or a community that has limited resources. And this can be done inadvertently or purposefully in an effort to isolate the survivor. So unfortunately, again, oppression creates an environment where there may be these additional tactics of abusers that may prevent a survivor from, achieving help or relief from a situation. It's also important to look at the fact that oppression creates additional types of sexual harassment and sexual violence that LGBTQ survivors may face. So sexually offensive names and slurs is a way that they may experience that violence. They may be victim to sexual rumors or to non-consensual outing of their orientation or identity. And then additionally, they may have inappropriate or invasive questions about their anatomy or sex life brought up to them. And then there may just be general discrimination based on their sexual orientation and gender identity, which is something that we need to recognize as a form of sexual violence in itself. So there are all of these additional types of sexual violence as well that are very nuanced, that folks may be isolated from support as they navigate. Then on top of that as well, unfortunately, there are additional issues that LGBTQ folks are facing in communities. They have higher rates of intimate partner violence, higher rates of stalking, depression, homelessness, suicidality. They may have reluctance to seek healthcare. They may have reluctance to seek help within the criminal justice system. LGBTQ folks are facing higher rates of workplace discrimination and higher rates of familial rejection. So when we're kind of looking at these barriers, what might it look like if that person is, feeling threatened because of intimate partner violence or stalking? What might it look like if they're depressed? What might accessing services look like if they're homeless? Of course, again, attempting to navigate after sexual violence, what if they wanted to seek healthcare or some reprieve from in the criminal justice system and don't feel as if they can move forward doing so because of the ways that their community has been treated in that space. What might their support system look like if they've been rejected by their family? So the overlap of these additional oppressions is going to unfortunately create an environment where there is, just another level of barriers and isolation and real struggles that someone is going to face. And then additionally, we recognize as well that it can be hard to confront certain issues if you're attempting to meet your basic needs. So if somebody is potentially homeless, dealing with familial rejection, in their youth, they're so focused on their survival that they may not necessarily be in a spot where they have time or space, emotionally or just logistically to address sexual violence that they are experiencing or have experienced. So we really need to look at those additional issues as sort of additional barriers. We also think talking about microaggressions is something that's important to have, in this conversation. So for those of you who are not familiar, microaggressions are everyday slights, insults, and put-downs that marginalized people experience. Microaggressions are often delivered as sort of a compliment or joke, but they do have a hidden insult or problematic message that are attached to them. Those who use microaggressions may not even realize that what they're saying to someone is offensive, but microaggressions can still have a significant impact in a space or a relationship, regardless of their intention. So the example that I like to provide about this is a personal one. As a person who does identify as queer, I myself have had many people tell me that I, quote unquote, do not look queer. This is always sort of delivered to me as either a compliment or a joke. But I think we need to kind of look at what implication that comment has about LGBTQ folks, and think about how I might internalize my identity as a result of the way that that's being processed. So to give you some additional examples beyond my own experience, we have these images that we got from GLAAD where folks shared some of the microaggressions that they have experienced. So Jacob here, when are you going to really transition? Maya, you're so beautiful for a trans girl. Zoe, did you have the surgery? Shane, will you understand what it's like to be a woman? So again, think about the impact that those sorts of comments could have on someone's personal identity, of their ability to feel safe in a certain space, and how those comments could potentially wear someone down over time and overhearing it, and how they might hurt if they come from a potential support person, or how they might be processed if they are attempting to seek some sort of service or support and are hearing these microaggressions from that source. So what do you do if you get called out? If you use a microaggression, if you say something potentially problematic, because we recognize that, we're all in a process of learning, and, we all want to, if you're here, of course, want to learn more about how we can be supportive to folks. So if they're going to call us out, how can we respond in a way that's supportive to what they're saying? So it's really important to not over apologize or make a scene. It's just going to make a person potentially feel guilty for having said it. It's going to draw attention to the issue. So making a scene isn't really the way to go. You're going to want to make space, though, for the person to explain why the comment was hurtful if they want that space to use. But you don't want to put that burden onto them. So while you want to make space, you don't necessarily want to put pressure for them to have to educate you in that moment. They may really want to share with you what they're feeling or why it was problematic, and you should absolutely be willing to make that space and validate their concerns. But they may very well be exhausted from having to explain that. And that's something that's their choice, and it is really valid either way. You also can definitely do your own research. If the person that you are speaking with, calls you out and doesn't provide, feedback or information in that space, we'd recommend that you would find an LGBTQ-led organization and or an LGBTQ written source to learn more about what the right way to handle a certain situation is, why what was being said was problematic, and how you could do better to support folks moving forward. And then lastly, you don't want to discount experiences because it's something that you don't personally understand. It is not our place to necessarily, decide whether or not what we said was offensive. It's the place of the person who experienced that harm by what we said. So it's really important to just keep an open mind, to, again, have that space to validate that person's concerns, and to learn from the experience in a way where we can do better moving forward. So I know Barbie shared some really valuable information about pronouns earlier in the program, but along the lines of what we're discussing now, we just wanted to address a bit about pronoun use and how to deal with potentially slipping up on someone's pronouns. So of course you would never want to determine someone's pronouns, gender identity, or sexual orientation just based on their appearance, because you would not know from someone's appearance how they identify. Again, think about me and the comment that I've received from other folks. Those are individuals that didn't, think that I was queer when they met me, but I am queer, and nobody should assume that I am not. So you definitely want to keep it simple. Just ask someone, what are your pronouns? What's your name? As Barbie mentioned earlier, definitely avoid saying preferred pronouns or name. Someone's name is their name, and their pronouns are their pronouns. So just, again, keeping it simple, what are your pronouns? Of course, you always use someone's pronouns, even when they are not present with you. Of course, the exception being if they are not currently out and they request that you do otherwise. So if you are working with a client and they share their pronouns with you, you may want to have a conversation about whether they are out, whether those pronouns are comfortable, if they're comfortable with you sharing those pronouns in certain spaces, what spaces you can share them in, But that can definitely be a conversation that you have with clients and with folks in your own life to see what their comfort level potentially is. If the person is not around, but other folks misgender them, use the wrong pronouns, when they're not in that space, it's still critically important that you correct them. Even though the person is not there to hear it, it's definitely important as you build a supportive community to validate that person's pronouns, to validate their gender identity, and to hold that accountability in the space that you're in for other folks to do the same. If you find that you are struggling or stumbling in any way, there is a great website that I believe Barbie had sent over to our group when we were developing this program called practicewithpronouns.com. I can actually throw it in the chat so you have it on hand. But if you find that you're stumbling at all, it's okay to practice. Have a conversation about how great that person is and how much you appreciate them. Have a conversation about some time that you spent together. And in that, ensure that you're using their pronouns, ensure that you're using, their name, and kind of make that space to practice to ensure that you're more comfortable and not slipping up in the future. So what happens if you do slip up? First, quickly apologize, correct yourself, and move forward. Prolonged apologies, again, can be really uncomfortable. You don't want to put that person on the spot. You don't want to draw that attention to that space. And you also don't want to put that person in a position where they feel as if they need to reassure you based on your response. Taking accountability means kind of keeping your composure and not putting someone in that position. Of course, the exception to moving forward with the conversation would be if that person wants to have a conversation about it, in which space you definitely want to make space for them to bring it up and carefully listen to what concerns they may have. So, what considerations, with all of this being said, should we have for prevention of sexual violence and response to sexual violence when, speaking with LGBTQ folks? So of course you want to implement prevention approaches that are going to promote social acceptance and recognition of healthy, respectful relationships, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. That could mean using inclusive language in programming, in materials, in resources, and in policies. So review the paperwork that you're utilizing and ensure that, rather than have little check boxes, you can have a line for someone to put their gender. Will truly make a significant difference from the gate when you're engaging with LGBTQ folks in your community. Just show that it is, a more inclusive space. Look at your policies. In what ways do your policies, include LGBTQ folks in the same way that it includes cisgendered and heterosexual folks? How does your mission statement potentially, provide that kind of support and inclusivity? So definitely just look at any sort of messaging, any sort of programming, and ensure that it is really inclusive. When you're giving a presentation in, a prevention education space, depict LGBTQ relationships, and then any other programming that you may have as well, you would want to ensure is inclusive. So for instance, if you're delivering programs on sexual health or about healthy relationships, anything about families, just continue to include those examples, continue to keep some of those barriers in mind, and, keep in mind that there are going to be LGBTQ folks in the room that may not feel represented unless there's that sort of inclusion. So in addition, you would want to consider what specific needs LGBTQ survivors may be facing in your community. So again, because you would want that to be informed by communities, that could involve some outreach, but see what that might look like. See if there is a lack of, health education in that space. See if there is a need for housing, a need for mentorship. Look at what that might look at what needs might be there in your own specific community, because it can definitely vary from space to space, and you'd want that to be informed by the folks that are witnessing it and experiencing it firsthand. It's also important to consider what efforts may already be ongoing to address sexual violence in that community. So again, because of some of the isolation that LGBTQ communities have faced historically, sometimes pride centers or LGBTQ centers, spaces like that, have sort of become catch-alls for all crises that LGBTQ folks are experiencing. So there may already be some efforts that are ongoing in that space, and what might it look like for you to engage in those efforts, rather than just expect folks to come to you. Of course, you're also going to need to evaluate community readiness alongside that. So look at your own agency, look at the community itself, the larger community that you serve. Look at the folks in your agency. If it's a social situation, look at your own friend circle, and consider what that readiness looks like. Where are folks coming from in this work with their understanding, and how could you potentially aid them in gaining more understanding if that's necessary and that readiness is not there? You also want to address all layers of violence and not focus on one thing specifically. So of course, you're going to focus on intra-community violence. So that would include hate crimes perpetrated by heterosexual cis people against individuals who may identify as LGBTQ. You're going to look at intra-community violence. So that could include intimate partner violence in a same-gendered couple, sort of like that scenario that I mentioned with the barriers. And then also you want to look at structural violence in your community. So what heterosexual policies and practices exist that create a level of violence or oppression against LGBTQ folks. When you're referring survivors, you want to ensure that you are referring them to culturally appropriate and accessible services. That definitely requires some research and some honesty. So when you are providing that referral, it's definitely important that you're upfront with that person about your understanding of that resource. What is their competency in serving LGBTQ folks? What is the capacity that their service has to support LGBTQ folks? So it's definitely important to keep that survivor informed about those limitations, about that capacity, whatever the case may be. And it's also important to do your research. And as we say with, so many things with survivors, you would not want to make any promises to that person that space may be able to help when unfortunately, they could see some oppression in that space. And then of course, if they engage with that and provide you with some feedback, that's something that, that experience is definitely one to listen to, because it's coming directly from the person experiencing that oppression. Again, with any survivors, you're going to meet them where they're at. You definitely want to avoid assumption. So while we talked about the fact that LGBTQ folks have historically faced violence in medical communities and criminal justice communities, that does not mean that they don't wish to engage with those services. They could very well come to you because they've already decided that they want to engage in that service. So it's important that you don't make any assumptions, so that you can assure that you are really following them, allowing them to take the lead and tell you what support that they need to navigate however they want to. You also may need to include parts of their identity and some safety plan considerations. So again, if there's a tightly knit community, what does that look like as they navigate a safety plan? What does their safety plan look like if they are not currently out? What does their safety plan look like if they were removed from their home because of familial rejection? You're definitely going to potentially see some needs that that person may have in a safety plan due to their identity and the oppression that they have faced from society as, a result of that identity more so. You also want to use someone's language, so kind of pick up on what they're saying and mirror that language back to them. When they talk about what their gender identity is, their sexual orientation, their partner, the word that they use for their partner, do they use partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, etc.? What word do they use, and mirror that back to them? What words do they use about their own body? That's critically important. It may be hard enough for somebody to talk about their body under typical circumstances, but if you think about the impact that sexual violence could have on top of a situation where that person has faced oppression related to their body, there could definitely be a real difficulty in expressing themselves. So it's important to mirror that language back to them to continue to validate them, ensure you're building that trust. That being said, of course, you would want to build trust with that person. They may, again, be aware that there's violence that their community has faced in many different systems. And while you may know that they are in a safe space as a community that has faced violence in medical communities, violence in the criminal justice system, coming forward with sexual violence can be really frightening if they don't know what is going to be behind that door. So it's definitely important to build trust with that person through a lot of these efforts, but just the way that you would with any other client as well. It's important to maintain cultural humility, to continue to listen to LGBTQ folks and ensure that your policies, practices, and everything else is informed by them directly. No matter how much education you may receive, no matter how many trainings you attend, it's really important to recognize the limitations of that education. And it's important to learn that cultural humility by being willing to listen and trust the people who are directly experiencing that oppression and discrimination firsthand. Then as well, it is important, though, to continue to engage in training. However, that training should take place in an ongoing basis. It should not be a one-time occurrence because things are constantly changing. In order to retain information, we need to have it repeated to us. So definitely ensure that this is something that is ongoing in your agency, in your community, wherever you're coming from. And then additionally, you want to ensure that the education, the training that you're receiving, the feedback that you're receiving through that cultural humility is being applied to the work itself. Because we can be filled with knowledge, but not necessarily apply that knowledge. And it's important that both of those things are done. And then lastly, you want to ensure that the work that you're doing to be inclusive to LGBTQ folks, to provide service to LGBTQ folks is intersectional, it's inclusive to the whole LGBTQ community, and that it includes your entire institution's community. So for instance, if you are at an institution or organization that has multiple departments, regardless of that department's role, it's critical that they all receive training so that that organization or institution or group is on the same page with what they know and where they stand and how they help others. So I know I threw a lot at you, and we will have some time for a Q&A at the end. So I look forward to seeing if there are any questions from folks then. But as we move forward and talk a little bit about resources and such, I will pass it over to my co-facilitator, Amanda.
Okay. Hello again. Oh, is there an echo? Nope. All right, we're good. So just important reminders, because again, there's so much that we threw at you. And again, we thank you for being here for this training. It's a little long, but hopefully valuable. So number one, I probably don't need to say this, but just listen and keep an open mind. Even all the information that we're giving today, a year from now, this could look slightly different. There are things that we're going to need to update. So even if you think you might know something and someone might correct you and you might be like, but I thought I learned it like this, like just know that it's just always evolving all the time. So again, just listen, have that open mind. And as we've said before, just actively learning on your own time. So, thank you for coming to this training, because that's an important step that you already took in learning. But there's many resources online. There's lots of educational videos online as well, through YouTube. There's many people who give their own personal experiences to things. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, there's plenty of people who have shared their story online and want it available for people to understand. So feel free to do that too. Not to assume someone's sexuality or gender identity. That goes from either someone's appearance, or even if, let's say, if you were to see a couple that is perceived to be heterosexual, you might not know there might be one, if not both, people who identify as LGBTQ, but they just happen to be, seeming heterosexual couple. So just keeping those things in mind as well. Not to assume that someone is out. If someone shares with you that they are part of the LGBTQ community, just know that they trusted you with that information, just as if a survivor of sexual assault were to tell you their story, you wouldn't then go sharing with everyone else unless they, for whatever reason, gave you permission to do that. But, that's not your story to share. Any anti-LGBTQ comments or jokes are harmful. I know there have been a few times I've heard people say like, oh, LGBTQ plus or LGBTQ I's and A's and what are their Z's? Like, oh, there's so many of them. Like, and saying things like that, right, is just very insensitive. And as I've told you, there's so many acronyms that encompass so many identities, as well as from going from country to country, and that changes. So, if you ever hear anyone say that, whether it's your friends, family, coworkers, let them know that, you find that offensive or that that's not appropriate to be saying. And, just standing up for the community, even if there isn't someone within the community that isn't in the room, like we should be doing that just in our everyday lives in general. And also just confronting your own prejudices and bias, even if it's uncomfortable to do so. So, it's uncomfortable to think about at times, but everyone has implicit bias, right? So we're influenced by our experiences from growing up, whether that be, from our society, any sort of cultural ideas we grew up with, media portrayals. There's lots of movies like I look back on now from probably like 10, 15 years ago that are very problematic. But me growing up with those films, right, it was teaching me things as I was growing up that I've now had to unlearn and realize, oh, that's actually really not okay to say, or this isn't a joke, because it's making fun of a community or individuals or people's experiences. So just being willing to confront that within yourself too, because we all have it and we're all working together to deconstruct all those things that we've learned. So that's kind of just like all encompassing everything. There could be many more bullet points here, but just a really quick synopsis of that. So now we'll share some resources that are available that you can share with your clients or any friends and family who are seeking support.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Amanda. So starting with the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is a really excellent resource for LGBTQ youth, especially those who are feeling in crisis, if they are suicidal. So they have a phone, text, and online chat that is available to LGBTQ youth, I believe, going up to the age of 24. So their website is listed here, and that's definitely an excellent resource to anybody that may apply to. They've really done a lot of great work. And then additionally, Trans Lifeline is a really incredible resource. So they have a hotline, and it is a peer support service that is provided to trans folks specifically. So meaning it's all staffed by other trans folks. So if they need someone to talk to, they can call. It can be because of a crisis, but it can also just be because, somebody may be feeling alone and need that sort of connection. So they're really there for any need that the caller may have. They do provide full anonymity to that person and really protect their confidentiality in that way. And then it's really important to know as well that they have a policy of not conducting any non-consensual active rescue. So if somebody tells them that they're in crisis, they are not going to get law enforcement or medical interventions involved without that person's consent. I actually know some folks that are involved with Trans Lifeline, and they really do incredible work. They have a very passionate staff, some really great volunteers. So if you want to learn more about their services and what that looks like, you can go to translifeline.org, but that's definitely something that I would recommend, folks kind of have on hand. So additionally, there's some local resources. Amanda, do you want to jump in and share? I know that you had added a couple, but I could share the beginning. It's up to you.
I got it. It's good. So those are some great national source. Actually, I think Trans Lifeline is also in Canada too.
It is. Yeah.
So that one is international. But those are some great national resources, and I wanted to provide some local ones as well within Connecticut, except for one of them, but I'll talk about that. So True Colors Inc., you may have heard. So that's an organization that provided many support services for LGBTQ youth, including virtual support and social groups. Unfortunately, recently, due to the pandemic, all of the programs at True Colors have been put on hold as of 2 weeks ago. They will be hosting a virtual conference in May this year. They usually have an annual conference. So just keeping that in mind for whichever point they might return their services. But other ones that are still available to people is the New Haven Pride Center. So that organization also gives support groups, social groups for youth and adults. They also have case management support services to help LGBTQ folks secure housing, have access to food, stable employment, legal assistance, and community support. The Triangle Community Center is similar to the New Haven Pride Center, but their case management services are only for young adults, 18 to 25. All of this information can be found on their websites as well. And so the reason why I have the Loft on here, and it wouldn't only be the Loft, there could be many more. So the Loft is actually in New York, specifically in White Plains. But what I was discovering after doing some research is because of the pandemic, everything's pretty much have gone virtual. So many of these places had their own support groups that people can, drive to, come in person. But now that everything's virtual, there really are no borders. So for instance, the Loft, as well as I imagine the Pride Center and the Triangle Community Center as well, is they're having virtual support groups, and there are people jumping in from other states because maybe the center that's near them doesn't have a peer support group of maybe could be for queer youth or any pansexual support groups or really just all different kinds. So even if it seems I don't know if Connecticut has this specific support group that someone may be looking for or a virtual support group, they very well might be able to find another resource that's in New York or maybe even in Pennsylvania where they might have one. And from what, I've seen, they're very open and willing to let people in from outside the state. But of course, you could always call and ask just to make sure before giving a resource like that. But the Loft has been, from my experience, welcoming of people from all over, even outside of the country of the US. They've had people jump in on virtual support groups. So just know that that's available too. And hopefully once, the pandemic is hopefully one day over, that this is a service that maybe they continue to provide if they see that there is a need. for it to be virtual. So just know that these are available as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And then lastly, of course, for those of you who are not attending from our own agency or member centers today, a little bit about us, the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. We are a coalition of 9 member centers located throughout the state of Connecticut. We provide a variety of services to survivors of sexual violence on our hotlines, which you see listed here. We have a 24/7 statewide hotline in both English and Spanish. The services through those hotlines are free and confidential. Callers would be linked to an advocate that can help talk them through what's going on, emotionally, as well as what steps they can take, and will sort of take their lead moving forward with the options provided. So as listed there, they can provide safety planning, crisis counseling, online support groups, or previously in-person support groups, legal services, probation support, and honestly, so much more. It's really incredible work that each of these centers do. And, I'm so glad to be able to provide support in my own position at the Alliance. And then additionally, for anybody who wants to, communicate about the Queer Caucus Against Sexual Assault, it's a group of LGBTQ identifying advocates from those member centers as well as from the Alliance staff. So once again, I facilitate those meetings. So if you are coming from one of those centers and you're interested in engaging in QCASA, or if you, are not from one of those centers, but you're interested in potentially collaborating or at least, getting to know QCASA a bit more, we're definitely always open to those sorts of collaborations. So please feel free to reach out to me. I will put up the final slide with my own information so that you have that on hand. So all of that being said, I see a lot of really nice messages in the chat and we really appreciate it. But before we close out today, does anybody have any questions at all for us based on the content that we presented? I want to remind everyone as well that the session is being recorded. So feel free to put it in the chat if you're more comfortable. I see there, Amanda also has put our feedback form in the chat. So if anybody is interested in providing us with some feedback about today's program, it would be so appreciated, so we can continue to integrate that feedback into the content that we continue to create for all of you.
Kaylee, I see that you have your hand up. I'm going to try to unmute you in case you have a question.
Yes, there we go. Thank you. I was also trying to turn on my video so I could see you guys. Thank you again so much. This was fantastic. I know I tuned in the last time you all did this presentation, and I had a bunch of really specific immigration questions, which you were gracious enough to answer for me. I wanted to just know, and this would be, I guess, geared more at Amanda and Bridget. Barbie, I will take you off the hook for this as you are an attorney. But if you two have any thoughts specifically about what attorneys working with this population should know, whether, from your experiences working with survivors and things you've heard from them about their interactions with the legal system or attorneys, or your own experiences, but just if there's anything in particular for this line of work, particularly as our program is really trying to make a concerted effort over the coming years to reach out more to the LGBTQ community and make sure that we are more readily available to them as a resource.
I can start if you'd like, Amanda, unless you wanted to jump in. I had something immediately come to mind based on some experiences that I've had in direct service previously. So the first thing that sort of came to mind is a remembrance of how many times a survivor navigating a legal system may have been, really misgendered through that system, had their dead name, which for those of you who may not be aware is the name that somebody was, assigned at birth. And it is no longer a name that they utilize, and it is an act of violence to utilize that name against them. So really, I've known folks who are being, who are going through that system, really misgendered, having their dead name used, having all of that sort of information invalidated by some of those systems. And sometimes that comes from a place of misunderstanding. Sometimes, unfortunately, it comes from a place of, their name not being legally recognized or something of that nature. So I guess my advice in that case would just be to perhaps know some information about how they could further pursue, making that legal if that's not something that they already have support with. While I'm not sure if that's something you'd be able to provide any assistance with, it's at least some information that you can have or have a referral on hand if they want to navigate that process to change any of their legal documentation. But then additionally, I think what's going to be critically important no matter what is to really continue to affirm them, to continue to use their name, use their pronouns, use their identity and orientation, and ensure that in your role, you are providing that affirmation so that you can really build that trust and at least provide them with one safe space through what otherwise could be potentially a tricky and upsetting system. But that, I guess, would be my advice based on all that that I've seen. Any additional points, Amanda?
I feel like you talked about a lot of them. One thing that came to mind, which might be not exactly like, I guess I'll just say, so, because I'm thinking, I don't have any personal experience through the direct service of having like someone who may be LGBTQ then going through the criminal justice system, working with a lawyer. But some things that would come up, for instance, is like there are stereotypes that come up for sexual assault survivors as well as for LGBTQ people. Sometimes, I'm echoing. Hello? Okay. That sometimes intersect. So for instance, there might be like a stereotype related to male sexual assault survivors who, let's say their offender is also male. Sometimes like the fear for them coming forward is that they now think that because they were assaulted by a man, they now are like, oh, well, I don't know if I want to say this because now people might perceive me as gay, right? And that's like stereotypes and misinformation that they have about like the LGBTQ community, or it could even be that someone is LGBTQ and then maybe they were assaulted, but maybe they might also be, misconstrued with the misinformation they've received from society, that they might think it's because of the assault. So I guess if you happen to hear anything, from an attorney perspective, like where maybe those stereotypes are coming out and they might be shaming themselves, like just making sure to have the resources available to them to, reach out to maybe an LGBTQ advocate that can help them sort through those personal issues they may be experiencing on top of going through, the criminal justice system. So I guess that's more so like just keeping an ear out if you hear someone that may be really struggling internally, whether they identify as, straight or gay or you're queer in general, because again, it's just like society paints survivors as well as LGBTQ people or LGBTQ survivors with just like this brush of just like misinformation, stereotypes, shaming, and just like listening out for that. And or even if they don't say it, just providing them with those resources so that, if they feel more comfortable kind of sharing that, whether that's in therapy or with a counselor, that can be addressed so that hopefully that'll alleviate any sort of stress or struggles they may have, with just kind of trying to start the healing process. I know that's a bit like not completely centered on like the question that you had brought up, but it was just something that came up for me that I've definitely seen before. But yeah, so hopefully that was helpful.
Absolutely. Those are both excellent, and both of them had me thinking about separate things. So I really appreciate that, that feedback. And I'm hearing a theme from both of you of just making sure that we have those resources, like some of the ones that you all identified, making sure that we have those on hand so that we are able to have them ready for our clients so that they can get support outside of what we're able to do in the legal realm, but then also making sure that we are using every opportunity and every venue possible to affirm our client's identity, whatever that might be. And so, yeah, thank you. Last time that we attended this, we made a couple of revisions to our intake form, and I actually just had a.
Oh, you were somehow muted. Can we unmute Kaylee?
Sorry, not totally important. I was just rambling and basically trying to validate back what you all were saying, and thank you very, very much.
Yeah, no, and thank you for, taking the information and like making those like procedural changes like within your program as well. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really important. And I think just as a quick follow-up, anytime folks are accessing new resources. And I know you would do this anyway, because I know you and I know how thorough you are in all of your work. But I would definitely, recommend really, really vetting any program that you use for referral for LGBTQ folks, because unfortunately, some of them can really create harm for folks, unfortunately. So ensuring that those resources are vetted, that they are ideally created by community members. And if for any reason they are not, they are continuously advised and informed by those folks. But yeah, I definitely would just recommend anybody seeking resources to just fully vet them to ensure that you are not referring someone to a space where they could potentially face more oppression.
Can I ask another question that just made me think of? I'm so sorry. I did this last time. I totally monopolized you all at the end of this. It's just so good, and you guys are just such fantastic resources. Are you familiar with any programs or any support resources that are geared specifically towards immigrant members of the LGBTQ community? I'm thinking particularly for language access, but also kind of the cultural humility piece too, because that's a whole other layer on top of, what clients are facing being part of the community, the existing stuff from their own cultures from back home. And so it's just another layer of complexity that I have found seems to sometimes be a barrier with my clients wanting to engage with those types of organizations when I've mentioned them in the past. I don't know if that exists, but yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, I can jump in here because I've actually been looking for some. I've seen some, but none that I would pass on to yet, but it is something that I'm actively looking into to try to find a really good immigration focused resource. But so far I haven't found anything that's been very extensive. So that's why I am looking more into it, because a lot of the ones that I've saw just pretty much went over what we did today and maybe not as much either. So that is something that I am looking into.
I should have known. Thank you.
But that's definitely important. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's something important for us to keep in mind too, as we continue to do these types of programs. And also if we look into collaborating with these other organizations and let them know that, there is a need for this, let's try to find the right people that can put those sort of things together. Because we won't know unless people, let us know. So definitely thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think just one other thought from some of the communities that I've some of the organizations, I suppose, more so that I've worked very closely with. you know, under the LGBTQ umbrella is, as I mentioned at one point earlier, I think oftentimes Pride centers kind of became like a catch-all for different human service needs for LGBTQ folks. So I think it could be an opportunity as well to assess what work is already being done in those spaces to support, you know, peers that have varied immigration statuses. Because I know that there are some communities where that work to some extent is already done internally, and you know, folks are attempting to support one another in those spaces. So you know, that could be an opportunity as well to kind of connect and see what is already being done there. Still got some time. If anybody has any further questions, we'd be happy to answer. Okay. Well, seeing none at this time, my email is there. You know, I could definitely, you know, connect you with Amanda or Barbie with their consent as well, if you would like. Amanda has put the feedback form here one more time. If you wouldn't mind just filling that out again, it'll just take a couple of minutes, and it's so helpful in informing our programming to ensure that we are doing the best that we can to get this really critical information to all of you and engaging you in that process. You know, we want to thank you so much for being here today. It's such an incredibly important thing to show up, to do this really critical work. So thank you for showing up. Thank you for asking questions, for participating, for your presence, for all else that you've really given us in the last 2.5 hours here. And thank you for the work that you're doing, because you know, I assume you're here because you are in some human services capacity, potentially anti-sexual violence work as well. And that work is just so critically important. Helping folks is so important. So thank you for the work that you are already doing, and thank you for taking this step to continue to support the LGBTQ folks that you serve. All right, so with that, I'm going to end the recording. But thank you again so very much for your presence here today, and for all that you do.